Picture this. The year is 329 BC. The greatest conqueror the world has ever known is standing in the ashes of another burned village. Alexander the Great, the man who crushed the mighty Persian Empire in 3 decisive battles, is now fighting an adversary he cannot see, an opponent he cannot catch, a foe he cannot defeat. For 2 brutal years, Alexander's army has been bleeding in the mountains of Central Asia, not from glorious battles, not from honourable combat, but from ambushes, from raids in the night, from arrows that come from nowhere and melt back into the desert. His men are exhausted, his generals are frustrated, and somewhere out there a brilliant rebel commander named Spitamenes is laughing at him. The man who conquered half the known world is now trapped in a guerrilla war he's losing. And the brutal truth: Alexander is about to do something that will shock his own men more than any defeat. He's going to marry his enemy's daughter. This is the story of how the greatest military mind in history learned that some fortresses can't be taken by force, some wars can't be won with swords, and some victories require you to become the very thing you came to conquer. This is the siege of Sogdian Rock. This is why Alexander married Roxana. And this is the brutal truth of empire. If you're ready to witness one of the most insane military operations in ancient history and discover the political masterstroke that changed the face of the ancient world, smash that like button right now and subscribe to Wars in History. We're diving deep into the battles they don't teach you in school, the brutal, bloody, complicated truth of warfare. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens next. When Alexander crossed into Central Asia in 329 BC, he thought the hard part was over. He'd just spent 4 years systematically destroying the greatest empire on earth. The Persian Empire, which had ruled from the Mediterranean to India for 2 centuries, lay in ruins behind him. King Darius was dead. The Persian heartland was conquered. Every major city from Babylon to Persepolis had opened its gates to him. Alexander was 30 years old and master of the known world. He had every reason to believe that the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, remote mountainous territories on the very edge of the Persian Empire, would fall just as easily as everything else. He was catastrophically wrong. Bactria and Sogdiana encompassed what is now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and parts of Turkmenistan. This was the wild frontier of the Persian Empire, inhabited by fierce independent people who had never truly been controlled by any distant king. These weren't the urbanized, cosmopolitan Persians Alexander had faced before. These were nomadic warriors, mountain tribes, and desert raiders who'd been fighting for survival their entire lives. When Alexander first arrived, he seemed to be winning. The Persian satrap who controlled the region, a man named Bessus who had murdered Darius and declared himself the new king, was quickly betrayed by his own men and handed over to Alexander for a brutal execution. The major cities surrendered without a fight. Alexander established garrisons, appointed governors, and prepared to march on to India. But the moment Alexander's back was turned, everything erupted. The rebellions didn't start with grand declarations or massive armies assembling on battlefields. They started with a knife in the dark. A Macedonian garrison commander found dead in his bed. A supply convoy that never arrived at its destination. A messenger who rode out at dawn and was found full of arrows by sunset. The man orchestrating this chaos was Spitamenes, a Sogdian nobleman who had initially seemed to be Alexander's ally. Spitamenes had been one of the men who captured Bessus and turned him over to the Macedonians. But Spitamenes was no collaborator. He was a tactical genius who'd been studying Alexander's army, learning its weaknesses and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Spitamenes understood something that the Persian kings never had. You don't beat Alexander the Great in open battle. The Macedonian phalanx was too disciplined, their cavalry too skilled, and their king too brilliant. Every adversary who had faced Alexander in conventional warfare had been destroyed. But Spitamenes had a different plan. He would bleed Alexander. He would make the occupation so costly, so exhausting, and so endless that the Macedonians would eventually give up and leave. It was guerrilla warfare on a scale the ancient world had never seen, and it nearly worked. The rebellion exploded across Sogdiana in the summer of 329 BC. Spitamenes struck everywhere and nowhere. He would rally local tribes, attack a Macedonian garrison with overwhelming force, then dissolve back into the population before reinforcements could arrive. He recruited Scythian nomads from beyond the Oxus River, expert horsemen who could ride circles around the Macedonian cavalry while raining arrows down on them. Alexander's response was immediate and furious. He marched his main army north at breakneck speed, trying to corner Spitamenes and force a decisive battle. But every time Alexander got close, Spitamenes vanished. The rebel leader seemed to know exactly where Alexander was at all times, and exactly how to stay one step ahead. Then came the disaster at the Polytimetus River, known today as the Zaravshan. Spitamenes had besieged a Macedonian garrison at the city of Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand. Alexander, occupied with fighting Scythian raiders on his northern border, sent a relief force of over 2,000 infantry and 300 cavalry to break the siege. It was a significant force, but Alexander couldn't lead it personally. Spitamenes was waiting. As the Macedonian column approached, he lifted the siege and retreated toward the river. The Macedonian commander, eager for glory, pursued. It was exactly what Spitamenes wanted. At the Polytimetus, the Sogdians and their Scythian allies unleashed a tactical masterpiece. Mounted archers circled the Macedonian formation, shooting from a distance that the heavy infantry couldn't close. Every time the Macedonians tried to advance, the nomads simply galloped away, then turned and fired again. The Macedonians had never experienced this kind of warfare. Their discipline began to crack. In their panic, the Macedonians retreated to an island in the middle of the river, thinking the water would protect their flanks. Instead, they had trapped themselves. The Sogdian and Scythian archers lined the river banks and shot them down like fish in a barrel. By sunset, the entire relief force had been annihilated. 2,000 men dead or captured. It was the worst defeat Alexander's army had suffered in Asia, and Alexander hadn't even been there. When news reached Alexander, he force-marched his army back to Maracanda, covering over 100 miles in 3 days. But once again, Spitamenes had already disappeared into the desert. Alexander pursued him deep into the wasteland, but the rebel leader was too smart to be caught. Finally, Alexander turned back, burying the dead from the Polytimetus massacre and facing a harsh reality. He was fighting a foe he didn't know how to beat. What happened next revealed the darker side of Alexander's genius. If he couldn't defeat Spitamenes militarily, he would destroy the rebellion's support base. For the rest of the summer of 329 BC, Alexander's army devastated Sogdiana with systematic brutality. Fields of crops were burned, villages were razed. According to the Roman historian Curtius Rufus, Alexander ordered the execution of every male of military age in rebel territories. The message was clear: if you support Spitamenes, you will die. This wasn't the Alexander of legend, the noble philosopher king who wept at the siege of Tyre. This was Alexander the pragmatist, willing to commit atrocities if they served his strategic goals. Empires aren't built with mercy. They're built with blood and terror. The Scorched Earth campaign worked, partially. The rebellion didn't end, but it lost momentum. Spitamenes continued his raids throughout 328 BC, but with less support from the local population and fewer resources to draw on. Finally, at the Battle of Gabai in late 328 BC, a Macedonian force caught and defeated Spitamenes' army. The rebel leader fled to his Scythian allies beyond the border, hoping for sanctuary. The Scythians made a cold calculation. Spitamenes was now a liability. To make peace with Alexander, they murdered Spitamenes, cut off his head, and sent it to the Macedonian king as a gift. The 2-year insurgency was over. Its brilliant architect was dead. But the war in Central Asia was far from finished. With Spitamenes dead, Alexander believed the rebellion would collapse. He was wrong. What he faced now was something even more dangerous than a charismatic leader with a unified strategy. He faced the decentralized resistance of dozens of local warlords, tribal chiefs, and nobles who refused to surrender. Each one had retreated to their own mountain fortress. Each one believed they were unconquerable, and each one would have to be taken by force. This was the nature of guerrilla warfare that nearly broke Alexander's army. The Macedonians were masters of siege warfare, but traditional siege engines were useless in these mountains. These weren't cities with walls that could be battered down. These were fortresses built on natural rock formations, accessible only by narrow paths that a handful of defenders could hold against an army. Alexander spent the winter of 328 BC systematically hunting down these holdouts. His army split into multiple columns, each tasked with reducing specific fortresses. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Every stronghold was a miniature campaign. Some surrendered when they saw the Macedonians approaching. Others fought to the last man. Alexander was learning that every empire eventually faces this challenge. Winning the war is one thing. Holding the peace is something else entirely. The Macedonian soldiers were reaching their breaking point. They had been on campaign for 7 years. They had marched from Greece to the edge of the known world. They had fought in deserts, mountains, and jungles. They had conquered the greatest empire in history, and now they were bleeding and dying to take nameless fortresses in the middle of nowhere, fighting opponents who would never surrender and could never truly be defeated. Morale was cratering. Discipline was fraying. Alexander himself was showing the strain. His legendary temper was getting worse. In a drunken rage at a banquet, he personally killed Clitus the Black, one of his oldest friends and most trusted commanders, because Clitus had criticized his increasing adoption of Persian customs. The murder shocked the army and revealed just how much the endless war was changing their king. But Alexander knew something his men didn't. He knew that empires aren't held by force alone. At some point, you have to turn enemies into allies. At some point, you have to make the conquered people believe they have a stake in your rule. Alexander had been studying Persian customs and adopting Persian advisors precisely because he understood this principle. He wasn't trying to rule Central Asia as a foreign conqueror. He was trying to become their legitimate king. This was the strategic calculation running through Alexander's mind as he approached the most formidable fortress in all of Sogdiana. A place the locals called the Sogdian Rock, the final refuge of the most stubborn rebels, the place where everything would change. The Sogdian Rock rose out of the landscape like a geological impossibility. Ancient sources describe it as a massive plateau with sheer cliffs on all sides, rising so high that men standing at the base looked like ants to the defenders above. Modern historians have debated its exact location. Some believe it was near the modern Uzbek-Tajik border, Others place it further south, but all agree on one thing: it was considered absolutely impregnable. The fortress wasn't built by human hands, it was carved by nature and improved by human ingenuity. The approach paths were narrow and exposed, easily defended by a handful of archers. The defenders had stockpiled enough food and supplies to last for 2 years. Natural springs provided unlimited water. Taking the Sogdian Rock by conventional siege would be impossible. Starving them out would take longer than Alexander could afford. Inside the fortress were the families of the last major rebel leaders who refused to submit to Macedonian rule. Among them was a Sogdian nobleman named Oxyates. He'd been one of Spitamenes' key allies, and he knew that surrender meant certain execution. Better to die free on his impregnable rock than beg for mercy from a foreign king. With Oxyates were his wife, his sons, and his daughter, a young woman named Roxana, whose beauty was already legendary throughout the region. When Alexander's army arrived at the base of the Sogdian Rock in early 327 BC, he did what he always did first. He tried negotiation. Alexander sent heralds up the approach path under a flag of truce, calling for the defenders to surrender. He promised fair treatment. He offered generous terms. He reminded them that resistance was futile. Every fortress in Central Asia had fallen to him eventually. The defenders' response became famous. According to the ancient historian Arrian, the Sogdians laughed at Alexander's heralds. They told the messengers to go back and tell their king to find soldiers with wings if he wanted to capture their mountain. No other men could threaten them. The fortress was blessed by the gods and protected by the earth itself. Let Alexander come and break himself against their rock. When this message was delivered to Alexander, his face turned red with rage. His generals expected an explosion, the legendary Macedonian temper that had killed Clitus and cowed armies. Instead, Alexander went silent. His mind was working. The defenders thought they were safe because conventional tactics wouldn't work. So Alexander would do something unconventional, something impossible, something that would break their will before he broke their walls. That night Alexander called for volunteers, not for a frontal assault, not for a siege, for something far more dangerous. He needed men who had rock climbing experience, men who weren't afraid of heights, men who were willing to risk everything for glory and gold. He promised extraordinary rewards to anyone who could scale the cliffs under cover of darkness and appear on the summit at dawn. 300 men stepped forward. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the elite, men who had been with Alexander since the beginning, men who had stormed walls at Tyre and Gaza, men who had crossed the Hindu Kush and fought in places that didn't have names. They had learned rock climbing from previous sieges, developing skills that no ancient army had ever required before. Alexander's plan was insane, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying. The 300 volunteers would climb the steepest, most difficult section of the rock face, precisely because it would be the least guarded. The defenders assumed it was impossible, so they wouldn't be watching it carefully. The climbers would use iron tent pegs and strong flaxen ropes. They would hammer the pegs into cracks in the rock or into hard-packed snow, then use the ropes to pull themselves up inch by inch in total darkness. The volunteers prepared their equipment as the sun set. Each man carried 30 iron pegs, several lengths of rope, a knife, and nothing else. No armour, no weapons. Every ounce of weight could mean the difference between reaching the top and plunging to their death. They blackened their faces with ash and wrapped their hands and feet in cloth to improve their grip and muffle any sound. As the moon rose, the 300 began their ascent. The ancient sources don't provide minute-by-minute details, but we can reconstruct what must have happened based on the terrain and the equipment they used. The first climbers would have searched the rock face for natural cracks and outcroppings. When they found one, they would hammer in a tent peg, test it with their weight, then tie off a rope. The next climber would use that rope to ascend, then hammer in another peg higher up. It was agonizingly slow work. Every movement had to be careful and silent. One falling rock could alert the defenders above. One climber shouting in fear could doom them all, and it was cold, brutally, dangerously cold in the mountains at night. The climbers' fingers went numb. Their muscles cramped. The wind threatened to tear them off the rock face. Not everyone made it. About 30 men fell during the climb. Some lost their grip when exhaustion overwhelmed them. Others trusted their weight to pegs that pulled free from crumbling rock. They fell silently into the darkness, their bodies lost in the deep snow at the base of the cliff. The ancient historians note that their bodies were never recovered. The snow was too deep and the terrain too treacherous. But 270 men kept climbing. For hours they inched their way up the rock face, driven by Alexander's promise of rewards, by their own pride, and by the knowledge that turning back was now more dangerous than going forward. As dawn approached, the lead climbers reached the summit. They had done the impossible. They were above the fortress, looking down on the defenders' positions. Following Alexander's instructions, the climbers pulled out pieces of white linen and began waving them like flags. In the grey, pre-dawn light, Alexander's army at the base of the fortress could see the signals. The king immediately sent a herald forward, the same herald who'd been laughed at the day before. This time the herald's message was different. He called out to the defenders in a voice that rang with triumph. He told them to look up. Alexander had found his soldiers with wings. The heights of the mountain were now in Macedonian hands. The fortress was surrounded. Resistance was over. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. The Sogdian defenders looked up and saw what they thought was impossible. Macedonian soldiers bristling along the summit ridge above them. In reality, there were only 270 lightly armed men up there. They had no siege equipment, no real weapons, and no way to actually storm the fortress from above. But the defenders didn't know that. All they saw was that their impregnable fortress had been penetrated. The gods had abandoned them. Nature itself had betrayed them. The surrender came within the hour. The gates opened. The defenders laid down their arms. Alexander had conquered the unconquerable fortress without fighting a single battle. It was one of the most brilliant psychological operations in military history. A victory won not through strength, but through audacity and the careful manipulation of his enemy's fear. We're going to continue this story in just a moment, but first, if you're loving this deep dive into the most insane military operations in history, you need to check out our official Wars in History merchandise. We've got everything from campaign maps to battle-themed gear that lets you wear your passion for military history. The link is in the description below. Every purchase supports the channel and helps us bring you more content like this. Now let's get back to what happened when Alexander walked through those gates, because the real masterstroke was yet to come. As the Macedonian army entered the Sogdian Rock fortress, Alexander's men expected the usual aftermath of a siege. Prisoners to be sorted, leaders to be executed, treasure to be catalogued, supplies to be confiscated. What they didn't expect was for their king to fall in love, or at least to claim that he had. Among the prisoners was Oxyates, the Sogdian nobleman who'd been one of the rebellion's key leaders. With him was his family, including his daughter Roxana. The ancient sources all agree on one thing. Roxana was extraordinarily beautiful. The historian Plutarch writes that she was the most beautiful woman in Asia after Darius's wife. Arrian, usually more reserved in his descriptions, calls her a woman of remarkable beauty. Even allowing for ancient historians' tendency toward exaggeration, Roxana clearly made an impression. Alexander met Roxana during the formal surrender ceremony. According to tradition, the noble families were presented to the conqueror so he could decide their fates. When Oxyate presented his daughter, something shifted in the room. Alexander, who had shown little interest in women during his entire campaign, despite having captured numerous Persian princesses and noblewomen, suddenly declared that he would marry her. His Macedonian generals were horrified. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. If Alexander wanted a wife, he should marry a Macedonian noblewoman, or at least a Greek. A political marriage to a Persian princess from the old royal family would have seemed understandable. But Roxana was neither Macedonian, Greek, nor Persian royalty. She was the daughter of a rebel warlord from a remote mountain province. She represented everything the Macedonians had been fighting against for 2 years. But Alexander's decision wasn't about romance, and it certainly wasn't about lust. This was about empire. Alexander understood something that most conquerors throughout history have failed to grasp. You cannot hold an empire through fear alone. At some point, you have to give the conquered peoples a reason to accept your rule. You have to make them believe that they're part of something larger than their own tribal loyalties. By marrying Roxana, Alexander was sending a message that echoed throughout Central Asia. He was saying, "I am not here to replace your leaders with foreigners. I am here to become your leader." His children with Roxana would be both Macedonian and Sogdian. The old Persian Empire had been an empire of subjugation, distant satraps extracting tribute from resentful provinces. Alexander's empire would be an empire of fusion, Greek and Persian and Sogdian and Egyptian all melded into one. The marriage ceremony took place in 327 BC at the Sogdian Rock itself. Alexander insisted on a traditional Macedonian wedding ceremony, not a Persian one. This was important symbolically. Roxana wasn't being absorbed into some Persian harem as a concubine. She was being elevated to the status of a Macedonian queen. The ceremony involved the sharing of bread, a symbolic act where the bride and groom each cut a loaf with a sword and offered it to each other, representing the sharing of life and fortune. For Oxyates, the father who had expected execution, this was salvation beyond his wildest dreams. Not only was he spared, but his daughter was now the queen of the largest empire in the world. Alexander immediately appointed Oxyates as provincial governor, giving him real power and a stake in the new order. Other Sogdian nobles who witnessed this were given a clear message: cooperate and you will prosper. Resist and you will be destroyed. But if you join us, you can become us. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. The Bactrian and Sogdian armies, which had been fighting the Macedonians for 2 years, suddenly became much more cooperative. Local nobles started pledging loyalty. The remaining rebel strongholds began surrendering without a fight. Within months, the region that had nearly destroyed Alexander's army was pacified. Not through more violence, not through more scorched earth campaigns, but through a wedding. Alexander's Macedonian companions remained deeply unhappy about the marriage. They saw it as another example of their king going native, abandoning his Macedonian identity for foreign customs. These tensions would continue to grow throughout the remainder of Alexander's life. But from a strategic standpoint, the marriage to Roxana was a masterstroke. Roxana proved to be more than just a political symbol. She travelled with Alexander during his subsequent campaigns into India. She gave birth to a son in 326 BC, though the child died in infancy. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, Roxana gave birth to another son, Alexander IV, who was declared one of Alexander's successors, though both Roxana and her son would eventually be murdered during the wars of succession that tore apart Alexander's empire. The symbolism of their existence mattered. For a brief moment, there really was an heir who represented both East and West. The marriage also established a precedent that Alexander would expand on later. In 324 BC, at Susa, Alexander organized a massive wedding ceremony where he and 80 of his senior officers married women from Persian and Median noble families. 10,000 of his soldiers were also given bonuses to marry local women. Alexander was trying to create a new ruling class that would transcend ethnic boundaries. A cosmopolitan elite that could govern his vast empire without the constant threat of nationalist rebellion. Did Alexander personally love Roxana? The ancient sources disagree. Some claim he was genuinely infatuated with her beauty. Others suggest the entire romance was calculated theatre, designed to sell a political arrangement to both sides. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Alexander was capable of genuine emotion. His grief at the death of his companion Hephaestion was legendary. But he was also a brilliant political operator who understood the power of symbolism. What we can say with certainty is this: the marriage to Roxana represented a different kind of conquest. Every fortress Alexander had taken before the Sogdian Rock was taken by force. Every opponent he had defeated was beaten on the battlefield. But in Central Asia, Alexander learned that some victories require you to embrace your enemy rather than destroy them. Some wars end not with the death of the rebel leader, but with his daughter wearing your crown. This was Alexander's true genius, and it's the reason his empire lasted as long as it did, which, admittedly, wasn't very long after his death. But the idea he represented, the vision of a multicultural empire that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries, would influence every empire that came after, from Rome to the Mongols to the British. The siege of the Sogdian Rock and Alexander's marriage to Roxana represent one of the most fascinating pivots in military history. For 2 years, Alexander had tried to conquer Central Asia through conventional means, through battles, sieges, and brutal reprisals. He had killed tens of thousands, devastated entire regions, and pushed his army to the breaking point, and he had barely managed to achieve a stalemate. Then, in a single night, 300 men climbed an impossible cliff and changed everything. Not because they killed anyone, but because they broke the enemy's belief in their own invincibility. And in the aftermath, Alexander made a choice that his generals couldn't understand, but that history has vindicated. He chose fusion over domination. He chose to become part of the world he had conquered rather than remain forever foreign to it. This is the brutal truth that every empire eventually faces. You can conquer with swords, but you can only rule with legitimacy. Alexander understood this in a way that few conquerors before or since have understood. He knew that the tribes of Central Asia would never stop fighting a foreign occupier, but they might accept a king who married their princesses, honoured their customs, and gave them a place in his new world. Did it work perfectly? No. Alexander's own Macedonians resented his adoption of Persian customs. The empire fell apart immediately after his death. Roxana and her son were murdered in the brutal succession wars. But for a brief moment, Alexander created something unprecedented. A truly multicultural empire that spanned from Greece to India, where a Macedonian could govern Bactria and a Sogdian could command Greek troops. The story of Alexander and Roxana reminds us that warfare isn't just about tactics and logistics, it's about understanding people, their fears, their pride, their beliefs about what's possible. The defenders of the Sogdian Rock believed their fortress was impregnable, so Alexander showed them wings. The rebels of Sogdiana believed Alexander was a foreign invader, so Alexander married one of their own. In both cases, he won not by being stronger, but by being smarter. That's the lesson of Bactria. That's why Alexander married his enemy's daughter, and that's why, 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it. If you want to go even deeper into the wars that shaped history, join our Patreon community. Patreon supporters get early access to videos, exclusive content, behind-the-scenes research notes, and the chance to vote on future topics. We're building something special. A community of people who understand that history isn't just dates and names, but stories of human courage, cruelty, brilliance, and failure. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching Wars in History. I'll see you in the next one.